In this session, we'll be looking at chapter 9. This is called Heart for God, the Prophets. Now, if you're like most people, when you hear the word prophet or the word prophecy, you get ideas about visions as well as predictions regarding the future. Actually, Old Testament prophets had two primary functions. The first is what we might call forthtelling. The second is foretelling. What is forthtelling? It is warnings to return to the obedience of the Mosaic covenant. Foretelling is this aspect. If you don't, here's what's going to happen in the future. Most of what the prophets spoke about was future to them, but is past to us. Less than 2% of their prophecies are about the Messiah. Less than 5% speak about the New Covenant era. And less than 1% of the prophecies are yet to come. The chief job of these prophets was exhortation. They were the covenant enforcers, if you will. Under the New Covenant, we would put preachers into this category, exhorting God's people to walk in the ways of the covenant. Now, the Old Testament prophets consistently called God's people to return to the tender, fatherly heart of God, being spiritually formed by the prophetic book of, say, Habakkuk. Now, I know a lot of us spend a great amount of time in the book of Habakkuk in our private devotionals. He was called to prophesy to Judah, that was the southern kingdom of Israel. Now, Habakkuk had looked at the corruption around him, and he asked in chapter 1, and he asked us of God, what are you going to do about the evil and injustice that is happening in Judah? God answers, I'm going to send the Babylonians to destroy them. Now, as you might imagine, this answer shocks Habakkuk, who then asks, how can you use a people that are more wicked than us to punish Judah? And God's second answer in chapter 2 is this, my judgment, which is right, will surely come. And Habakkuk's response in chapter 3 is fascinating. He prays and he praises God, and he resolves to remain faithful no matter what happens. So here's what we can learn from that. God never chastises Habakkuk for asking the hard questions. God wants us to come to him when we are perplexed, confused, or don't understand life. We learn how God works in our lives as we see how he dealt with the people in the past. You know, in Israel, God had rescued them time after time, but they would eventually slide back into sin. And God eventually reached a point where he knew that discipline was going to be the answer. You see, God will use whatever means that are necessary in order to bring us back to him. You know, in chapter 3, Habakkuk does an interesting thing. He reviews how God has acted faithfully in the past. And therefore he, and we as well, know that he can be trusted with the future. Now, there are three characteristics of Old Testament prophets. Number one, as I said earlier, they are covenant enforcers. Generally speaking, the priests spoke to God on behalf of the people. The prophets spoke to the people on behalf of God. Now, when we looked at Old Testament narratives, we saw several things. Humans were the main character. God is the hero of the narratives. Looking at the prophet, there's a little bit of a difference that we want to notice. Prophets are the main speakers. God is the source of the speaker's words. Now, as the covenant enforcers, the prophets were continually reminding God's people of their contract and the consequences both of obedience as well as disobedience. This harkens back to what we discussed about Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, there's a listing of the various types of prophecies on pages 185 and 186 of Playing with Fire. Our primary task is not to identify the type. That's just interesting information, if you will. What we want to take note of here are what we might call oracle units. Now, these books are not like narratives where there's a story where we can look at a beginning and a middle and an end. What we want to look for is significant shifts in topic. The wording will shift, and this will help us to bring out the meaning within each individual unit. Now, the prophets are going to require historical background study. Looking back to Habakkuk, unless we understand the author, the historical setting, the recipients, and information about what is going on in the lives of the people, we simply will not be able to understand fully what Habakkuk is about. Here's where outside help can be very helpful. Get yourself a Bible dictionary, a Haley's Bible Handbook, Bible encyclopedias, a good study Bible. I'm going to recommend this to you, and it's called the Essential Bible Companion. You can get this on Amazon for $10, and it is a great background. Within 2 pages, you'll get history, background, key verses. I recommend that you get this book. Now, the prophets make specific and holistic contributions. The prophets are always calling God's people back to the blessings, but also warnings of the curses of the Old Testament covenant. Now, we're not under this covenant, but we can learn about God's steadfast love. We can learn about His holiness and His people's tendencies, that includes ours, to wander from Him. God was not so much interested in outward obedience as He was in the inward bent of their hearts. You know, as Moses wrote and Jesus quoted in Deuteronomy 6:5, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." And finally, it is not only Israel's relationship with himself that concerned God. He was also vitally interested in how they treated each other. Now, while there are some social justice issues and teachings in the New Testament, we really have to go to the Old Testament and the prophets for a full treatment on this issue of social justice. All of the above are timeless lessons. Specific contributions to the prophets regarding our spiritual formation. First, the biblical books, and these can be found on page 189. Here's their primary contribution. They exhort us about the rewards of covenant obedience, and they warn us of the discipline of disobedience under the old covenant, so that we are challenged to maintain our heart for God and our just treatment of others as we live under the new covenant. So therefore, we want to ask this. What does this passage or oracle tell us about Israel's behavior in her covenantal relationship with God, and about God's response to His people, and those areas that we may also be susceptible to neglect within our new covenant relationship with God? There's a secondary contribution that we want to give heed to, and that's this: to give us glimpses into the immediate future of God's people, or into the distant future of the Messianic New Covenant era, and the superseding blessing of life in this climatic area. Therefore, we want to ask this: what does this passage or oracle tell us about God's plans for Israel, now or in the past, or His plans for His new covenant people in the present or still in the future? So in conclusion, the prophets encourage us to stay faithful even in the midst of difficult and trying circumstances. Knowing in light of our glorious future with the Messiah Jesus, we can trust in Him in the midst of the most trying circumstances today. So I would encourage you, be strengthened by knowing that the same God who acted faithfully in the past will do so in the future. Take heart in the fact that since every other Old Testament prophecy came true, we can trust that those that speak of the work and the return of Jesus are true as well.